he controlled for lead and iodine at the time. He's controlled in retrospect for arsenic. He controlled for parents' education and a lot of other social factors. And he compared the IQ of children in 2 villages with different well water doses. So the low fluoride village, the well water average was 0.36 parts per million, and the high fluoride village, the average was 2.5 parts per million. I think you'd agree that these are not high numbers when you're looking at fluoridating at 1.1 part per million and you've got no way of controlling the dose. And your kids are getting other doses. Let me tell you something else. I could say this later, let me tell you now. One of the other things which I found out from Zhang, because I went to these villages, one of the things I found out from Zhang is most of these kids do not use fluoridated toothpaste. Most of these kids are breastfed and not bottle-fed. So those 2 factors would suggest that these children may actually be getting less fluoride than we are getting. We're getting more fluoride, our kids, because they're stuffing themselves with fluoridated toothpaste and they were probably bottle-fed. Okay, let's go on. They control for lead and iodine. They found a drop of 5 to 10 IQ points across the whole age range, and the whole IQ curve was shifted over for both males and females. So here's it for males. So the black curve is the low fluoride village, average level 0.36. The high fluoride village, the whole curve is shifted over. It means you've got less very bright kids and more mentally handicapped kids, based upon this study. Now they did something else, which only became clear to me in the last year when we went back and looked at this more closely. Zhang did something that none of the other studies did. He divided the high fluoride village, Womayo, into 5 different subgroups with different fluoride concentrations. You see that? 0.75, that was just only 9 kids in that, but that was the lowest concentration. And then the second one was 1.5, third one, 2.46. This is the water levels, 3.28, 4.16. Now, what he's doing here is he's knocking out any differences between the 2 villages, because we're only in 1 village. So let's look at what happens to the IQ in those subgroups. You see, as the fluoride concentration goes from 0.75 to 4.16, the IQs drop systematically. And to show that, here's a graph. Here's a graph. It says, as the fluoride concentration in these subgroups goes up, the bottom axis, the IQs go down. Interesting. He did something else. He looked at the percentage of the kids who had an IQ less than 80, which covers borderline mentally handicapped, that's IQ 70 to 80, and outright mentally handicapped, less than 70. Look at the percentages. Look at A. There was none. At the 0.75, there was none in that group of mentally handicapped. You go to 1.5, 10%. You go to 2.5, 14%. You go to 3.28, 21%. You go to 4.16, 37.5% of those kids are mentally handicapped or borderline mentally handicapped. That's devastating. Devastating. And there's the graph of that. And from this also, if you go to the lowest level at which IQ is lowered, notice that I'm assuming that 99 is as close to 100, so we won't bother with that one. But for B, at 1.5, you've got an IQ drop of 5 IQ points. Well, let's look at that. Some of those, it's 1.5 plus a standard deviation of 0.27. That tells you some kids in that group were drinking water at 1.53 minus 0.27. So it's a range. So some kids in this experiment had their IQ lowered at 1.26 parts per million. That's what those numbers say there. Not all of them, but some. Now, this leaves nowhere near an adequate margin of safety to protect all children drinking water between 0.7 and 1.2 for two reasons. First of all, there's no margin of safety to take into account the range of doses in our populations, because some kids drink much more water than others. So some kids drinking 1.2 parts per million, to say that they drank 2 litres of that, they would be getting more fluoride than the kid in China who's drinking 1 litre at 1.26. So there's no margin of safety to protect against the range of exposure. And the other thing is there's no margin of safety to protect for the whole range of sensitivity to any effect like this. You have to, basically what toxicologists do, if they find an effect at a dose, the so-called lowest observable adverse effect level, the standard methodology is to divide that dose by 10 and say that is the dose that we're pretty confident which will protect everybody in a large population. Where you start dividing these I know these are concentration, not doses, so you have to an extra step, but there's obviously nowhere near a margin of safety to protect every kid in Australia drinking fluoridated water from lowered IQ. And that's what Bill Hersey, who did this for a living. He did health risk assessment for a living as a professional, a senior scientist at the US EPA for many, many years. He's retired, and on February the 21st in Sydney, he will do a risk assessment, a formal risk assessment, which he would have done at the EPA to determine what level of fluoride is safe in milligrams per day for a child. And the shocker is that before you even consider water fluoridation, our kids are exceeding that dose from other sources, like toothpaste. So the conclusion is not only will we have to end fluoridation, but we will have to stop people using fluoridated toothpaste. If you take risk assessment and the protection of your kids' brains seriously, obviously our health agencies don't. I've been through all that. Now there's been another study, this is a preliminary study of only 51 children, but the same team from Harvard, Choi, plus a very famous neurochemist, neurotoxicologist, David Bellinger, who is a world expert on lead neurotoxicology, looked at these children, and they gave them a batch of tests. And one of the tests was you give the kids a series of numbers, and you ask them to repeat it. And then you ask them to give you the numbers backwards. So you ask them to do it forwards, and you ask them to do it backwards. And it turned out that the kids, there was a significant difference between the ability of kids to do that who had moderate or severe dental fluorosis and the kids who had very mild or no dental fluorosis. This is what I mean about using dental fluorosis as a biomarker of exposure. So this is only a preliminary test, but in all these things, it's all going in the same direction. Now, this is what Grandjean has said. Fluoride seems to fit in with lead, mercury, and other poisons that cause chemical brain drain. And he, as I said, he's just written this book, published this year. It's entitled, last year, Only One Chance. Now, this is what Grandjean has said. You can find videotapes of him on the YouTube. And he goes through what I'm about to do with you, and some of you have seen it before. IQ, like every other human trait, follows the normal distribution, bell-shaped curve, what I talked about before, okay? So most of your population will have an IQ that clusters around the average of 100, but it's what happens at the two tails which is very interesting. The green area represents the fraction of the total population which is either very bright or genius. There are an IQ above 130, you're in the green. Now over here, if you have an IQ less than 70, you're mentally handicapped. Okay, those two areas are of interest. Now, if you were to lower the IQ of the whole population, if you had a whole shift over, which is what we saw with Zhang's study, a whole shift over, you wouldn't notice, if you were a parent, you wouldn't notice the difference between two siblings, one with an IQ of 100, one with 95. Nor would a school teacher, you wouldn't notice it. But look what happens to the two tails when you shift over by 5 IQ points. In other words, the temptation is to say 5 IQ points is not a big shift. Is it? On a population level, it's devastating. If you shift over by 5 IQ points, you halve the number of geniuses in your society and you double the number of mentally handicapped. And if, as a government official, you know there's a chemical out there in ordinary life or in commerce that can do that, you would do everything that you could to limit exposure of the population to it. And when you've got a situation where this particular chemical is deliberately added to the drinking water, it's a bit obvious what your policy should be. Would you agree? Pretty obvious. This is something that we're doing to ourselves, or rather what we're doing to our kids' brains. If you respect science. Now, I can't give this the weight that I would with some of the other things, but it just happens to be, it's an interesting coincidence. What Bill Osmondson did was to plot the percentage of children that were mentally handicapped, mental retardation in 1992 by state. And then he plotted these numbers against the percentage of the population was fluoridated. And what this says is the percentage of children who are mentally handicapped increases as the percentage of your state that's fluoridated increases. Now, I would not offer that as proof, but it's illustrative. It's obviously much more has to be done to control for all the other things that might be doing them. But at least it is, again, it's consistent. Now, since 1986, the US EPA has been in a position where they can end fluoridation. I'll explain why. The EPA, since 1986, has had no authority to regulate additives to water. Only contaminants. It can regulate, so notice it doesn't regulate water fluoridation because that's something that you add to water. That's not their job. Their job is to focus on contaminants, pollutants that have got in there either from natural sources or from industry pollutants. Contaminants or pollutants. And their job is to determine a safe level for those things. And your agencies do the same thing. That often copy our standards. So they do have jurisdiction over contaminants. Now, what they have to do for the contaminants, they have to determine two things. One is the MCLG, the maximum contaminant level goal, and the other is the maximum contaminant level. Now, the maximum contaminant level goal is the safe level. It's the level that we're pretty certain is protective of the whole population. The rubric of the Safe Drinking Water Act is that this level, this MCLG, should protect the whole population from known and reasonably anticipated health effects. So that's the MCLG, and that's the number that we're interested in right now. But there's this other thing called the maximum contaminant level, which is the federally enforceable standard. That's a goal. It's not federally enforceable. But the MCL, the maximum contaminant level, is the federally enforceable standard. And at that point, they take into account economics. How much is it going to cost communities to remove the fluoride? And if it's a lot of money, then you can't make that MCL too low. That's what happened with arsenic. The MCLG for arsenic is 0 because it's a known human carcinogen. But you can't get communities in the Midwest or the Western states to get the arsenic down to 0. It costs billions. So the final MCL is 10 parts per billion. In other words, it's a compromise based upon economics. I hope this is not going too far afield, because you're about to witness the politics, the absolute central kernel of politics as applied to regulation in the United States on fluoridation. Wait for it. Now, in 2011, there was a press conference in January the 7th in DC. And there, the deputy administrator, or the assistant administrator for water at the EPA, this is what he said. EPA's new analysis, this is what they were asked to do by the NRC in 2006. And they're still working on it in 2011, and they haven't finished it in 2015. He says, EPA's new analysis will help us make sure that people benefit from tooth decay prevention, while at the same time avoiding the unwanted health effects from too much fluoride. Now, I guess some of you are laughing, so you've already spotted this. Their job is to determine the safe level, the MCLG. They shouldn't be concerned about what it does to children's teeth, or what this might be. That's somebody else's job. So let's continue. Let's continue this story. That's a shocker. They were telling us that they were going to make the MCLG above 1, so that water fluoridation will continue. So under the guise of regulating fluoride as a contaminant, setting a safe drinking water goal, they're actually protecting the water fluoridation program. And they are determining an MCLG. The determining an MCLG should have nothing to do with any perceived benefit. Okay. The EPA is colluding with the human health services to protect the fluoridation program, and using bad science to do it, which I'm going to show you now. They say that in order to determine the MCLG, they're going to assume that the most sensitive endpoint, health endpoint to fluoride's toxicity is severe dental fluorosis. That's the most sensitive endpoint, and they're going to use that to determine the MCLG. And they claim that if they protect against severe dental fluorosis, they will not only protect the teeth from this effect, but they will also protect the bone, presumably over a lifetime, and they will protect every other tissue. I think you're probably gathering where I'm going to with this. Okay, so they're saying that severe dental fluorosis is the most sensitive endpoint, but this is nonsense. To demonstrate that severe dental fluorosis is the most sensitive endpoint, the lowered IQ, they would have to show that all the children in all 43 studies who had their IQ lowered had severe dental fluorosis. That none of them had moderate or very mild or mild dental fluorosis. This is where the story gets interesting. So how many of these 40-plus studies have they looked at, and what do we know? Well, no. Okay, so now I will introduce some of the players here. This is Zhang. This is Zhang, who did the study in 2000. That is me, a little younger. This is in September of this year. This was the day after the FAN conference, the 5th Citizens Conference on Fluoride. This is Chris Neurath, who's our scientific advisor, Chief of Scientific Research. I'm very poor at statistics, so I rely on Chris to make sure that all the statistics is right. And this is William Hersey, Bill Hersey, who will be in Sydney in February the 21st, whose speciality as a senior scientist at the EPA was risk assessment. So those are the characters. And when Zhang was at our conference, we asked him to get all his data and see how many of the kids that we have data for lowered IQ, what levels of dental fluorosis did they have? Okay, the left-hand column is the severity of dental fluorosis. 0 means no dental fluorosis. 1 means very mild. 2 means mild. 3 is moderate, and 4 is severe. Here's the IQ for those children. This is all the data. What do you notice? Children with very mild dental fluorosis had lowered IQ. Children with mild dental fluorosis, lowered IQ. Children with moderate dental fluorosis, lowered IQ. It's impossible. It's impossible for the EPA to maintain that severe dental fluorosis is the most sensitive endpoint. They should, if science had any validity, be forced to analyze lowered IQ. Lowered IQ is the most sensitive endpoint. And that is why, on the day after our conference, we all went to, as I said, Bill Hersey was presenting his study, but we went to the EPA. This was taken outside the EPA water office after we'd seen 2 of the top officials, shared this information with them, and Bill Hersey did his risk assessment, which he'll do again in Sydney, for lowered IQ, and left it with them. We haven't heard anything since. This is September. But we're still hoping that somehow science will prevail over politics. But that's it. If politics prevails, you'll know it, because the EPA will determine an MCLG with severe dental fluorosis. If science prevails, they'll do it for lowered IQ. That's where we're at in the United States. And if they use lowered IQ, it's over. It is absolutely over. Fluoridation is over. So please say a little prayer that somehow, just somehow, in that rotten, stinking cesspool called Washington, D.C., that somehow we'll get some integrity to prevail against people that supposedly are being paid by the US taxpayer. Phew! Oh, there have been some other studies since, and some of them are preliminary studies, but this one is interesting. This is again done at very low concentrations. This study looked at children being exposed to fluoride between 0.24 and 2.84. Conclusions. Overall, our study suggested that low levels of fluoride exposure in drinking water had negative effects on children's intelligence, and also they said they also confirmed this dose-response relationship between urine fluoride levels and IQ scores. And if you look at it, this bottom axis is the level of fluoride in the urine of the children, and that line coming down represents the IQ coming down. Now, it's preliminary. You'll notice that the variance, those vertical bars, overlap. So if you compare any 2 of those data points, they're not statistically significant. But if you look at the trend coming down, that has a mighty significance. A p-value of 0.0001. And I admit I'm not very hot at statistics. But that's an interesting study, albeit preliminary. Let's go, there's another one. Oh, 11 of the studies that Choi reviewed, the fluoride levels in the children's urine related to IQ, and they were less than 3 parts per million. So the fluoride levels in the urine of these children who had their IQ low was less than 3 parts per million in 5 of the studies. Now, studies have been done in England where they looked at fluoride levels in the urine. And Mansfield found that 18.1% of participants in fluoridated areas had urine fluoride levels above 2 parts per million, 5.6% had fluoride levels above 3 parts per million, and 1.1% had fluoride levels exceeding 4 parts per million. In other words, this is saying that Western people in Western societies do have the same fluoride exposure as in these Chinese studies. So again, we should take them seriously. And Zhang has gone on to show that the same is true of plasma levels, that the level of fluoride in the plasma, as the level of the fluoride in the plasma, the last stop before it goes into your brain, is also relates to the drop in IQ. The higher the plasma levels in those kids, the lower the IQ. Again, just adding strength to strength of these studies. Fluoridation is ineffective. I think in the interest of time, I would say this. Considering this is something that you force on people, and considering something for which we've got a lot of science which shows there is potential harm and serious harm, especially this effect on the brain, you have to have absolutely amazing data to demonstrate that this is so effective, that this was so incredibly effective at reducing tooth decay, that you would be prepared to do this. And I mean, I don't have time to go through all the studies. I did it last year, and maybe when you do the video, you can add the things here.